Can I tell you a nature joke real quick? Anybody want to hear a dark nature joke? Why did the chicken cross the road? Why did the chicken cross the road? Does anyone know why the chicken crossed the road? That's a good guess, to get on the other side, or to show the armadillo that it could be done. What do you think? Okay, again, hopefully you're hearing, getting a little bit of feedback there, but that should be all right. Okay.
So I think that's forward. One is forward. It's forward.
Perfect. All right, excellent. Thank you so much. And just caution with that joke if you're with sensitive people. So I'm going to be talking today, and thank you so much for letting me come and talk to y'all a little bit about moths. And I know that that can be kind of potentially a boring subject, perhaps, but I find moths incredibly interesting. They are so interesting. So we'll be looking at some moths and talking all about them today. Let's see. Oops. Looks like it's frozen on that screen. Hold on one second, bear with me. That's right, yeah, it didn't like that joke at all, did it? There we go, there we go. Okay, good. Yes, perfect. So the big question that I'd like to ask everyone is, what is in your yard? What is in your yard? Do you know all of the things that use your yard? And I was having a great discussion with Robin earlier about selecting some unique plants, some interesting, diverse, different types of plants. When we put in those plants, the primary purpose is for our enjoyment. We like to see those flowers, we like to see those leaves, all of that stuff, we do it for ourselves. The reality is, a lot of nature utilizes your yard. Nature uses your yard, and I think that's something to be celebrated. That when we put in a plant, we're also putting in potential habitat for different critters. And if you want birds, a show of hands, does anyone like birds? Has anybody seen a bird before? Okay, good. A few people like birds, yes. Me too. I love birds. And if you want birds, the truth of the matter is you need moths. You need moths. And what moths are ecologically, they're bird food with wings, or even young moths, which are caterpillars. That is ideal bird food. So if you want birds, you need moths. And I don't mean to patronize you with this. You probably have all been through second grade before and know about what a food web is. But when we look at it, all of these three things are connected to each other. So when we put in plants in our gardens, those plants are used by so many different things. Pollinators come to visit the flowers, but also some little tiny bugs start to nibble on that foliage. John Muir has a great quote. He says, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Kind of an interesting aspect there. One of the things I love to do is I love to go out and moth. It's what I like to do. I put on a light outside, I put on a sheet, I'll show you how to do that in a second, and I go out and look for moths. Great fun. My wife is a fabric collector. So she collects fabric. I guess it's quilting, but really, I don't know if you've heard of a thing called a stash. Have you heard of a stash before? My God, this thing grows and grows and grows. So we have a lot of fabric in the house. So whenever I'm out mothing and a moth or two will come fly in, she starts freaking out because of all of the fabric that we have. And it's true that there are a few moths that eat on fabric. Maybe you've had a favorite sweater that's been found by a moth. It happens. Yes, it happens. But most moths are not fabric eaters. Most moths are not agricultural pests. Only a few of them are. So let me talk a little bit about the life cycle of moths. Let's start with the egg. So which came first, the moth or the egg? Well, in this case, we'll start with the egg. The eggs, typically with most moths, they like to play the numbers game. So they will throw out lots and lots and lots of eggs with maybe a few of those eggs hatching. One of the first meals that those baby caterpillars eat is actually the casing of the egg shell. That's usually their first meal that they have. And then we have the larva, and this is the caterpillar. We don't have to do a confession here, but has anyone ever killed a caterpillar before? Has that ever happened? Oh, and we have one person that's good, even raises their hand. Yes, their MO, what they do in life is eat. They eat and they poop, and that's about it. That is all that a caterpillar does, eat and poop. And hey, I mean, we could sort of... You can do the analogies with us too. But their main objective is to eat as much as possible, to get as much energy as they possibly can. And I don't know how many of you grow tomatoes, but has anybody ever seen a tomato hornworm? If you leave a tomato hornworm on there, it'll take a couple days and that entire tomato plant is gone. That's because their purpose is to eat. Eat and eat and eat and get as much energy for the next stage. And then with most of our moths, they have cocoons. So this is the pupal stage. So they will, typically with moths, they go towards the ground to find a location for their cocoon. You can compare that with some of the butterflies that have the chrysalis, which is typically above ground. But this is where they go through that metabolic process, that metamorphosis to change from that caterpillar to the butterfly. It's also one of the reasons I like to say, leave the leaves. If you can, leave some of the leaves. I recognize that there are HOAs, that you have neighbors, people that point their fingers, that say, oh, you need to rake that up. Let me give you the excuse. I can give you, on behalf of Texas Parks and Wildlife, you don't have to rake all of your leaves. Okay, so just so that you have that. You don't have to rake all of your leaves. You can leave some of those leaves for the good of the moths and the good for all of the other critters. And then we have the adult stage. So this is where most moths, actually there are a few flightless moths, which are very, very weird, but most moths have wings. And these wings have itty-bitty tiny scales. If you've ever touched a moth, or if your cat has ever played with a moth, and some of that dust has come off, have you seen some of that before? Yeah, or grabbed a butterfly and it has all the dust that comes off. The reality is, all of those little dust particles are scales. Those are scales, and the order is Lepidoptera, which means scaly wings. So they have all scales that in some ways can form some really intricate patterns and even reflect off the light too. There's been some discussion on why they have those. Why do they even have scales? You know, not necessarily to impress you or I. Some of them may be used to impress either a female or a male, the opposite sex. But we actually think that way back when in their evolutionary history, that they would have this for their main predator, which is a spider. And a spider has a big web, and if you fly into a spider web, if you're able to lose some of your scales and fly off, that gives you a better chance of survival. So that may be a reason why those scales developed. Not going to get too much into the weeds here on the taxonomy, how they're related with each other. One of the things that I loved in one of my favorite books called For Love of Insects. If you're looking for a good book to read, For Love of Insects is a great book. Oh, it's magnificent. Written by a guy, Thomas Eisner, who's a chemical ecologist, and talked about the chemical communication that nature has, how ants communicate to each other, how even plants can communicate with each other using chemistry. But he talks about the distinction between a butterfly and a moth. It's much like the Romans and the barbarians. Back when the Romans were a thing, there would be the Romans, and anyone that wasn't a Roman was a barbarian. So all the non-Romans were barbarians. In the same way, we sometimes think that that's how moths and butterflies are. That we have the pretty butterflies, the Romans, the great Romans, and then everything else is a barbarian. But the reality is the barbarians are the most interesting, I think, too. So generally speaking, when we look at moth versus a butterfly, we like to say day or night, although there are some fun exceptions. Generally, moths are nocturnal. They're active at night, whereas the butterflies are diurnal or active during the day. But the antenna of butterflies and moths can be unique. When we see a lot of our butterflies, a lot of our butterflies have a clubbed antenna, as opposed to our moths, which lack that club and are sometimes filiform or have a whole bunch of little filaments that come off the antenna. Let's talk about why. All of these, well, actually, can I ask the group a question? Why do bugs have antenna? Does anyone know? Why does a bug have an antenna? I won't make fun. Yes, what do you think?
It senses the world around them.
It's like the nostrils of a bug to sense the world around them. So they have those antennas to pick up the chemoreceptors, or they have a lot of chemoreceptors to pick up, to sense the whole world. The males have typically a lot of filaments on here, more surface area for more chemoreceptors. The females will be basically exuding their pheromones, the smell of the females, and the males have these big antennae to sense them. And we'll be doing some experiments in a little bit to see if you can tell if it's a boy or a girl moth. So there are a lot of moths out there. There are a whole lot of moths. Globally, give or take 160,000 species. In Texas, we have over 5,000 species. How many can you name? Okay, brown one. Okay, I saw a brown one, and there's a gray one too, and maybe a brown with some gray on it. So 3 species, perhaps, is what we can name. And the reality is, just to be honest with you, before I got into moths, I kind of thought it was that they all were brown or boring gray. But when I started to take a deeper look, there are some intricate moths that we'll talk about in just a second. Some of them are big, some of them are small. Some of them, and we have this one here in Dallas-Fort Worth, this chinkapin leaf miner, that's a finger that it is on. But what incredible colors on this itty-bitty tiny creature, changing your perspective. We also have the black witch. This is one of the largest moths, a wingspan of give or take 7 inches. So far in in Texas, we've documented about 3,000 species. In Dallas-Fort Worth, a little over 1,000 species we've documented of moths. So let's talk about some moths, and I want a show of hands if you have ever seen one of these before. Has anyone seen one of these before? Very good. Polyphemus moth. Really interesting. The host plant for these guys typically go on red buds. bugs. That's one of the things that the caterpillars eat. They have these what look like cyclopean eyes right there, Polyphemus, named from the Iliad or the Odyssey, one of those, the Cyclops that Odysseus stabs that spike through the eye. But Polyphemus moth, really interesting one. I want you to look at these antennae, and apologies if you can't see it, especially there in the back. Lots of filaments. So what do you think, boy or girl? Boy, very good. Boy moth, lots of filaments there trying to pick up the smell of a female. A show of hands, has anybody been lucky enough to see a Luna moth before? Really cool. These are fascinating moths. Typically, they're more common in eastern United States, East Texas. One of their host plants are sweet gums. So if you have some sweet gums there in your landscape, you might see some more of these. There's a lot more sweet gums on the east side of the United States. Really, really interesting. I see a lot of filaments on those antennas. So what do you think, boy or girl? Very good, boy. So we have a lot of filaments there for a boy. With this one, in a show of hands, how many of you have seen one of these? Yeah, visiting maybe your lantana or your butterfly bush. A show of hands, how many of you like these? Oh, good. Can I tell you about the caterpillar of them? Tomato hornworm. I know! And the ones that you had killed, all of those. This is what the adult looks like. So the adult of your tomato hornworm, that's in a group called Sphingidae. They're called the sphinx moths because the caterpillars, whenever they're aroused, they sort of go up like this, like a great sphinx of Egypt. These are one of our diurnal species, or they're active during the day. They require a lot of nutrients, so they need that nectar, so they're nectar visitors. Oh, actually, I'm going to go back real quick. Both the Luna moth and the Polyphemus moth don't have working mouth parts. So as an adult, they cannot eat. They do not eat as adults. So kind of a bummer. Their last meal is as a kid, as a caterpillar. So that's it. But these guys, they do have that long proboscis, acts like a straw to suck the nectar out of those plants, perhaps a lantana or so. Let's look at the antenna here. What do you think? Not very many filament, boy or girl? Girl, very good, you're getting it. 3 for 3 on the ones that I've heard so far. A show of hands, has anyone seen an Io moth before? Yeah, Io moths, really, really incredible. Called the Io moth because of these big, big fake eyes. When they are alarmed, they expose those, and if you're a bird that normally loves to eat moths, you would be terrified if there's a face that's this big looking right back at you. So this is a defensive mechanism that this moth has. Another one, just for my enjoyment, boy or girl? Girl, you got it, girl. So that's a way that you can tell a boy or girl moth. And I challenge you, next time you see a moth, you say hello sir or hello ma'am based on those antennae. It will be impressed. How about this one? Anybody seen a black witch before? Seen a black witch before? Seen a black witch before? Mariposa del Muerte is another name for this. A lot of really interesting myths about this. If you see one of these, and that's a big moth, the one that you saw probably was a monster. They're big, very, very big, 7 inches give or take that wingspan. If you see one on your door, there are some myths that is an omen of someone that has died recently that is visiting you for the last time. Another one says that you're going to lose your hair soon. Another one says that you're going to win the lottery. The final one says that you're going to die soon. So I don't know if you get a choice on which one that is, but if you see one of these, check your pulse, wear a hat, and go buy a lotto ticket with that. But a really, really big, incredible moth here. A show of hands, anybody seen one of these? Little small guys, they will be visiting your flowers during the days. This is another diurnal moth. This is the Allianthus webworm. So some moths, and you probably have seen it maybe on a pecan tree, have that cluster, that webbing up there. There are some communal moths, or moths that stick around together. They form that silk cocoon, or that silk, not cocoon, that silk webbing up there to keep themselves safe. This is one of those webworms too. How about this guy? Has anyone seen this moth before? Looks very showy, kind of a charming, almost looks angry in this pose right here. One of the common names is southern flannel moth. When I show you the caterpillar, maybe you've seen it before. Ah, yes, and I know that saying, has anybody been lucky enough to touch one of these before? Yes, the asp. We call this an asp. This is what the adult looks like. A charming little moth, but this guy, they feed on oaks. A lot of our moths are specialists, so they feed on just one type of plant. This one feeds on oak leaves. So our asp looks kind of like a walking toupee, if you've ever seen one before. As a little kid, we had a tree house, and for whatever reason, it was on a big old oak. For whatever reason, these asps would always stay at the top of the ladder there, and I would definitely know that they were there. Some of our quote-unquote weeds that we have in our yards, one of them called the Carolina snail seed or moon seed. It's a vine. It's a pretty vigorous grower. This is the moth host, or that's the host for this moth. And I would argue that sentiment of mine earlier of just brown or just gray, pretty dang amazing. This is pretty dang amazing that lives right here in our own backyard. So that's one of the big challenges, is changing your perspective a little bit, looking closer at some of these critters. You can maybe even see that purple line and some of the golden reflective scales of this moth. Sure. Probably so. So the palps are these little kind of almost like the nose of it, and they're fairly compressed for this group. This is the snout moths. Boy, Greg and I are going to go do some mothing in a little bit, I can tell. But these palps up here, they're somewhat compressed or shorter than other ones. So very good. And the lovely, I tossed the Latin names on these guys too, which sometimes gives some reasoning behind the names. Yeah, we can play it here too. What do you think? I see some filaments here. Boy or girl? Sir or madam? Boy. I think this one's probably a boy here too. So again, I dare you, I double dare you, say sir or madam to the next moth that you see. Some of them have these very unique poses. Really, really crazy yoga pose right here. This is an eggplant leaf roller. The caterpillars of this, and these guys feed on the eggplant family, so Solanaceae. They feed on nightshades. What the caterpillars do is they basically roll up the leaf and eat their blanket. So they roll up the leaf like a sleeping bag and start nibbling on it. Pretty interesting way to live. But this one you can see, I don't know how many of you are into yoga. That's a good pose. I don't know how long you could hold that one. That one's pretty good, where its little nose is touching the tail end of its hiney. Pretty impressive on this one. You can see this one maybe on a white sheet, but if this was on the branch of an oak with some lichen on it, incredible camouflage that some of these moths have. And that's kind of how they live during the day. Why we don't see many moths during the day is they have this pretty incredible camouflage of blending in with the surrounding areas. Does anyone know what lichen is? Have you heard of lichen before? Yeah, lichen is kind of this relationship between a fungus and a bacteria, cyanobacteria. There are some moths that feed on lichen. So this is one of the moths called, well, a lichen moth, cystine or cystine. A very interesting one. We have several species of this here in DFW. Emerald moth, I agree. Very, very pretty with this one. But the really, really interesting aspect of these moths is in the caterpillar. How the caterpillar lives and the type of camouflage that it uses. Do you see it? Do you see it? It may be pretty hard to see. This is the caterpillar right here. One of the things that these caterpillars do is they go to a flower, they chew off the petals, and they glue it on their back. They glue these petals on their back and continue to eat the flower. Even more mind-blowing than that is as the petals start to fade, as they lose their color, they replace them with new petals. Incredible. This one's on a liatris right here. This little caterpillar right there gluing the petals onto its back. Pretty incredible. Really incredible. They're in this group called the geometrids. The common name is inchworms. Geometrid, measuring the earth inch by inch. So that's, they have this sort of characteristic look. But pretty amazing that these guys can do this, have that camouflage. And some of them, I would argue, are just really gorgeous. This one, you know, it's 10 millimeters, half an inch, give or take, and it's just a really, really pretty moth that exists like that. This one, probably a male. Do you see what I see? So this one, first of all, it's an aquatic moth. The moth itself doesn't live in the water, but the caterpillars do. The caterpillars live in streams and eat algae. But this one has what kind of looks like an interesting structure right here. And I don't know if you see what I see, but maybe a potential predator sees this. A jumping spider that kind of looks, there's the eyes of it, there's the legs, there's the legs, there's the eyes of it. Can you see it? And maybe, potentially, another potential predator sees that too. So a great way that this one can stay alive with that mimicry. Another great yoga pose here. This is a leaf miner. You may have seen this on some of the leaves of your plants, that there are little mazes in some of those leaves. Have you seen that before? Have you ever seen those little, what looks like little tubes or mazes? Those are leaf miners. Maybe not this species. We have a whole bunch of species that do this. But the caterpillar goes underneath the epidermis and in the mesoderm. So it goes in that leaf layer and sort of just nibbles on that and makes some really cool patterns. This one uses the plant Chinese tallow to do that. So there are a lot of really interesting, really cool moths, and I can tell that you want to go look for moths now. You want to go look for moths. And I would even, and I know I personify it, I would argue that moths are coming to your porch every night waiting for you. They are waiting for you to go outside and look at them. They're coming to your front door every night. So let's embrace that welcome. Let's embrace that welcome and go outside and look for them. Now the reality is probably tonight and tomorrow night is not a good night to look for moths. But let me tell you, I was doing some mothing last night. It was some great mothing. There was really good mothing last night in my backyard. So they are there, they are present, and they're waiting for you to appreciate them. Where do you look and when do you look? Well, nighttime. nighttime is the best time to look for moths. Ideally, you want a place with low light pollution, but the reality is here in Dallas-Fort Worth, here in Grapevine, there is a lot of light pollution everywhere. So I find, even in my backyard in Fort Worth, which is a very rural area, there are a lot of bugs that still come to my lights. The best result is when weather is higher than 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Summertime is the best time to look for moths too. We're not quite sure why they come to lights. It's an interesting discussion, and there's a book called Why Moths Hate Thomas Edison. And it talks about maybe some reasonings behind why moths come to lights. We don't really know. Some people think the theory may be that they use this as like celestial bodies, like the moon or the stars, and they use that to navigate, perhaps. Some people think that it's the reflection. It's like the moon reflecting on a body of water, that little light bulb. So perhaps that too. Even the chemistry of the UV, that wavelength, may stimulate certain sections of the antenna. A lot of ideas here, but we're not really sure why exactly they come. If you want to get into this, or if you have kids or grandkids or neighbors that might be into this stuff, it's easy to do. Party lights, black lights, this is that UV length, that wider spectrum of light is attractive to our moths for whatever reason, so even some of these cheapo party lights work. If you really get into it, if you get stung by the moth, and if you want to do this, let me tell you, my sleep patterns are totally jacked up because of this. I go out, and if I'm going somewhere doing a moth survey, just last year I did several of those down in the valley, and great fun, but the sleep patterns are ridiculous. So I will go to sleep for about an hour or so, wake up, and then look at the moth sheet, go back to sleep for an hour or so, wake up, look at the moth sheet. Horrible for my sleep patterns, but so exciting and so worth it. BioQuip, which actually just went out of business, so I need to change that slide. They did sell some of these higher, fancy, highfalutin UV lights or a mercury vapor. These get pretty powerful, but when you really get into this, this is how you attract even more bugs to those sheets. Whoops. Those white sheets are important too. So that white sheet acts a little bit like a mirror, reflecting that light back, so it sort of amplifies the wavelengths there too. I go out and I photograph these. I photograph a lot of the moths that come to my backyard or to my moth sheets. I use a headlamp and a little point and shoot camera. That works pretty well for those. If you want to know the names of some of these moths, it can be challenging. It can be very challenging, especially 5,000 of them in Texas, over 1,000 just in Dallas-Fort Worth. It can be hard to put a name onto a bug. I would maybe argue that the name isn't that important. It doesn't care what you call it. The moth doesn't care what name you give to it. You can still appreciate it no matter what you call it. But there are some good field guides to this too. Great websites. There's a whole website called Moth Photographers Group. If you have trouble sleeping, if you want to scroll through some moth pictures, this one has thousands of them, thousands and thousands of them. So Moth Photographers Group. They have a getting started page, which kind of helps you scroll through some of the pictures to try to narrow down that moth. Bug Guide, another great website where you can learn the names of some of these different bugs. You can submit pictures for identification for the experts to come help you identify them. I'm crazy about this. iNaturalist, I would argue it is the most powerful tool I have ever touched. For my thesis that was introduced earlier about gophers, pocket gophers, I studied the DNA of pocket gophers, so I used a DNA sequencer, a multi-million-dollar tool. With a lot of bias, this is a more powerful tool. iNaturalist is a more powerful tool than a DNA sequencer. It helps me engage with nature. As an urban wildlife biologist, I also take all those observations and I show them to city council, to park boards, and I say, hey, look, not only do we have a lot of different bugs, a lot of different birds, a lot of different plants, but we have a constituency of people that go to these areas to look for bugs and birds and plants and fungi. So super, super powerful tool. And you can use it also to submit photos for identification too. There is an app for that, so if you have a smartphone, you can get the iNaturalist app too. Mark your calendars. Mark your calendars. There is National Moth Week. Did you celebrate last year? No? We got to make it up. You got to make it up. So this upcoming year, July 23rd through the 31st, it is National Moth Week, and actually International Moth Week, where we go and do some mothing programs. I'm not sure if there's one here in Grapevine this year. We've done some of them in the past, but there's a lot of different locations where we're doing public gatherings. One in Garland that we're doing, one in Arlington, one in Midlothian. I'm not sure if we're going to be doing one, but keep an eye on the calendar for this too. And you can submit your observation of moths to show, yes, they're present, and yes, there's diversity here. If you need another good book. So I saw several people write down For Love of Insects as a good book to read. This is another great one. Native Host Plants for Texas Moths. There's a book on this. So if you really want some more moth diversity in your yard, in your park, wherever, this is a book. Oh, and I'm sorry, this is an old presentation. It is released, so it's out right now if you want to pick this one up. A good gift, too, if you're looking for something to get me. Could use some extra copies of this. One for my car, one for my pillow, one for the living room, one for the bathroom. So if you didn't hear anything I said today, that's okay. Let me tell you the honest truth here. Whenever you manage your yard or put in plants, please recognize, appreciate, acknowledge that those plants are being used by a lot more than just you and I. And in an area like Dallas-Fort Worth, in Grapevine, you have seen a lot of the development that has occurred, where areas where it used to be kind of wilderness, it's now homes. And before we cast a stone, I mean, I'm living in a home that was once cross timbers. It was once forest. So I'm not going to throw stones at all this new development. But because of that new development, that's the loss of habitat for a lot of critters. As maybe homeowners or park goers, whatever, we have an opportunity to put in different types of plants, not just for ourselves, but for so many other things. Things that come to your front door every night just to wait for you to come out and take a look at them. So the different types of plants that you have, the different types of moths that you have. Robin and I were having a great discussion earlier about trying out different plants. Have you ever tried out some different plants before? Some of the really common ones that you can get anywhere, those are great, they're very pretty, but my challenge, try out some of these different types of plants. The different types of plants, they may work, they may not work, but those different types of plants may be used by different types of bugs. And the different types of bugs are eaten by different types of birds. So it's all correlated. It's all connected there too. With that, I would love to address any questions, any comments. If you've ever seen an interesting moth before, let me know about it. But thank you so much for giving me a chance to come and talk to you. If you want to get a hold of me, I asked the state for the longest possible email address, and they gave it to me. So there is my name, Sam Kieschnick at tpwd.texas.gov. I'm also super active on iNaturalist. Sam Biology is my username. So with that, I would love to take any questions. Yes, Pam.
I'm concerned about what moths that don't eat. How long do they live?
Yeah, so Pam, I'll restate the question. So Pam lovingly asked this question, very motherly question, is you look hungry, but you cannot eat. You don't have mouth parts to eat. So what about the moths that cannot eat as adults? How long do they live? The blatant truth, oh gosh, I'm going to go all the way back. Sorry if this is causing motion sickness. But when I go all the way back to the adult moth, their main objective is to find love and quick. And that is what they do. They find that mate, they lay eggs, and they die. So with a lot of those ones, especially if they don't eat, and even the ones that do eat, they don't live long. They don't live long as adults. In some cases, like with our polyphemus moth or our Luna moth, they will live maybe for a few weeks as adults. In some cases shorter if they do that reproductive cycle, but they do not live long as adults. Their main purpose, they eat all their food as caterpillars. That's when they eat all of their food. They get all of their energy as caterpillars just to hopefully find love with wings.
They aren't multitaskers, are they?
Say what?
They aren't multitaskers.
They are not multitaskers. They are very focused. So they have one job. One job is to live and to find a mate, reproduce, and make babies. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
When is the right time to take your leaves up?
So a great question. When should you take up your leaves? So you have to talk to your HOA. So the reality is, and I'm going to give you kind of a hard answer here too, is the leaves are nature's way of recycling carbon. So a tree, if it's a deciduous tree, it loses its leaves. And those leaves break down into carbon and other nutrients naturally. So they basically form their compost for the roots there. However, we live at these places, and we typically do like to tidy them up a little bit. So I usually wait, and I have an area of my yard that I leave the leaves there all the time. But in my front area, which is actually very weedy, I like it, I rake those areas for the little forbs to pop up. So it really is up to you. Biologically speaking, as a biologist, when's the best time to rake your leaves? Don't. Yeah, don't leave them there. But I rake some of my leaves in my front yard, and I rake them over into that section in the backyard that's really messy. I love it. Yeah.
So I pile my leaves up as insulation on the plant.
Perfect.
And then I want to pull them back to the plant.
Yeah.
Springtime, the later the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. If you do have the opportunity to leave them there past spring, that's the best. Yeah, good. And again, if you want to get out of chores from someone, say, well, I heard that I don't need to rake my leaves for the moths. So you have full permission to not do that, to get out of chores if you'd like that. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Do you mind if I run over there and look? Ooh, so this one, gosh, I wish I had a way. I wish I had a way to show it. So this one, sorry, it's not going to work, but it's a really interesting one. That's called a question mark is the name of it. It's called a question mark. It is a butterfly. Gosh, I used to know the scientific name for it too, but question mark, and if you look at that little white dot, it sort of forms like a little question mark. So that's one of the butterflies, a nice one. And a beautiful thing about this too, and I hope, many of us have phones these days, and the cameras on our phones are getting better and better. If you take pictures like that, which I love that picture, post them on iNaturalist. iNaturalist is a way that you can get not only the name for that, but you get other people like me and others excited about seeing those sort of things. So yes, that's a really good one. Yes, ma'am. Yes, about the leaves. Composting, absolutely right. So the leaves add as compost. Absolutely. So there are a lot of uses for those leaves. So not just for the habitat of the critters, but also for the nutrients, recycling those nutrients. Thank you.
Can I ask another leaf question?
Sure, let's talk leaves.
Here, a lot of us have post oaks.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know if there's ever been a study on how long it takes the darn thing to compost. It's much longer than the
Yeah, so the question is about post oak leaves. How long does it take to decompose those? So we have, in my backyard is all post oaks. It's post oaks and blackjack oaks. So those leaves do take a while to break down. And that's just, again, nature's way of sort of taking time with it. So if I were to take a shovel and dig down into some of that sand, a lot of that sand is old post oak leaves from years and years and decades ago. So they probably do take a little bit longer than some of our other plants. Magnolias don't take too long to decompose. I mean, other things, don't take too long to decompose, especially if the conditions are right. But post oaks do take a while. I agree. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little more about asps?
Sure.
People are so freaked out about them.
Yeah.
I mean, do they sting or what is the...
So the question is about asps. A show of hands, how many of you have been stung by an asp before? Ooh, yeah. A show of hands, how many of you had a memorable experience being stung by a moth? Was it memorable? Do you remember the sensation that you felt? Yeah, so on each of these hairs, each of these little hairs, there is a toxin. So it's basically like a whole bunch of little tiny needles on this. And that's just how this thing protects itself. It produces a toxin that's found on all the tips of those hairs. So that's just how it works. People are terrified of these, and there are some years where we have population booms of asps, where it's a ton and ton of asps. They just are eating on the post oaks, on those blackjack oaks. So because we have maybe a good year of leaves or a good year of those trees, we might see a lot of these. Is the fear warranted? It hurts. I mean, yeah, it hurts. It hurts. I don't spray for them or anything like that. A lot of our pesticides, and I don't want to go too much onto this part, but those pesticides, we're actually seeing this with even our bald eagles that I've been dealing with for a little bit, that those pesticides continue throughout the cycle. That if the caterpillars are killed with pesticides, the birds that eat those caterpillars are also get some of that pesticide. So it's just something to recognize that when we have some of these and we consider them pests and they are eating some of our tomatoes or our prized possessions, when we utilize some of that chemistry, recognize that chemistry can persist in the ecosystem too. Not to say don't ever use pesticides. There are some cases where it's just overrun with stuff that I have to use the power of chemistry, but I also do it with kind of a heavy heart as I do it too. Yes, ma'am.
While I did pick off those caterpillars on these tomato plants, it was my job as a child, so you forgive me for that.
I forgive you.
Could you touch on pocket gophers for just a moment? Because I've got a gopher in my yard and it will not go away.
Okay, great. So first of all, started out with the confession of, as a child, that's how I got money, is by killing.
No money at all.
No money. Okay, all right. Okay, good. So yes, we all do that. My dad grows tomatoes and peppers and all that stuff, and my job is to find them. I usually don't kill them. I usually pick them up and then fling them far off. They're coming right back the next day, though, I bet. But a gopher question. Had a question on gophers. So here in Dallas-Fort Worth, we typically don't have too many gophers. We have moles. Moles have very shallow tunnels. These tunnels that sort of, as you step on them, you sort of go down a little bit. We have a lot of moles. So it could have been a gopher. It could have been a gopher. When I worked with gophers, the species I worked with was all of East Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. So I would drive around. I'd see someone that has gophers in their yard, knock on their door and say, "Can I collect your gophers?" Usually yes. But I also heard of how other people control gophers, and it's one of the last uses of strychnine that we allow. Yeah, I couldn't do it either. Some of the good old boys, in particular in East Texas, what they would do is just with the shovel, they'd dig into the hole, and they'd get a chair, and then they'd get their gun and sort of just sit there, which is kind of a funny thing to do on a Friday night, I guess. But one of the best way to control gophers is, gosh, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I got to be honest. The thing that I do, and I have a lot of moles in my yard, and I don't want to get too philosophical on you here, but I welcome them. I say, these guys, welcome. Yeah, they are aerating the soil, so there are some of those beneficial things, but they're really, so your lawn is full of air then with, yeah, it's a challenge, and there are some traps that people will use, some spike traps. The gophers that I used for my thesis, I killed 250 gophers. Okay, 251. There's a snap trap called the Maccabee trap. It's horrible. These two big spikes go back like that. There's a little trigger, and when the gopher hits it, it jabs the diaphragm. So it basically just punctures that diaphragm. They're waiting for me in the afterlife. I know that 200 gophers are waiting for me in the afterlife. It's also how I learned to sew, too. So I had to make specimens of these, and I had to sew the skin back together where we took the liver tissue. But anyway, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge with any sort of critter. And we're talking gophers, but you can talk about anything. We were talking wasps earlier, the joys of wasps. And yeah, it can be a bummer because they sting, they can hurt, but they're also providing a service. I mean, they're providing that service to us. With wasps, they're eating a lot of our caterpillars. They're doing the pest control for some of these things. But yeah, it gets a little bit more into the question of, who is this yard for? Is it for me? I mean, I own this yard. Is it for me? Or is the reality a lot of other critters are using this yard? Sir?
You may have just answered the question, but would you ask what are the common predators?
A great question. So what eats an asp? So other insects eat asps. Wasps eat asps. So that toxin, it's not effective to all organisms. So for us, with this sensitive skin, for mammals, it's effective, but not for wasps, not for praying mantises, not for spiders. So those are the natural predators of our asps. A good question, and I gotta be honest, I don't know if birds eat asps. Birds have tongues, and those tongues are sensitive, so it may be a defense against birds as well, that toxin. I'll have to look that up. That's going to keep me up tonight. Thank you. Yes?
I've heard that one way to tell a moth from a butterfly is when they're resting, whether the wings are open or closed.
Yeah, so a good question. So is the resting pattern a good way to tell moths versus butterflies? And I'll be totally honest with you, and it's one of the reasons I love biology, is that there's black, and there's white, and then there's gray. And biology lives in the gray. All of the rule breakers, the exceptions. So this distinction of a moth rest with their wings out or wings back, it's not true. There's different moths that rest in all different patterns. So with this one you can't really see it, but it sort of is forming like a tent pattern like that. With some of our geometrids, the inchworms, they'll be putting their wings straight out like that. So it's not really a good distinction between butterfly and moth. And that's the beauty of it, just the spectrum of gray. Anybody else have any other questions at all, either about gophers or moths? Again, thank you so much for giving me the chance to come and talk to y'all today. Really appreciate it.